So good morning to you all. This presentation is by Shazna and myself, and it is on mapping of the RSD-informed marking rubrics to USP graduate outcomes in undergraduate courses. Maybe I'll just stay on this slide. So the background to the implementation of RSD that has already been communicated by Professor Bamba and DVC Professor Armstrong. So we won't say much on the background, but just going further on, that from year 2012 to now, there are approximately 80 USP undergraduate courses that have developed RSD-informed marking rubrics for specific course assessments. So that's how far we have gone with the undergraduate courses, which is in addition to the foundation and the postgraduate courses. Next one. Yeah. So our presentation is looking at the overlap between the RSD framework and the USP graduate outcomes. When the implementation of RSD was recommended in year 2011 by Working Group 5, they highlighted that there is an overlap between the Research Skills Development Framework and the 7 USP graduate outcomes. Then last year, that is in 2017, the USP graduate outcome definitions were revised. So the criteria of the USP graduate outcomes were revised to ensure clarity and consistency in language, developmental progression across the undergraduate years, feasibility of use for assessment, and applicability across disciplines. Following the revision of the graduate outcomes last year, the research office remapped, so they carried out a broad level remapping of the RSD framework and the USP graduate outcomes, and that remapping has maintained that there is substantial overlap at the broad level between the RSD framework and the 7 USP graduate outcomes. So these are the current graduate outcomes that we have: communication, creativity, critical thinking, and quantitative reasoning. Quantitative reasoning was an addition last year in 2017. Teamwork, professionalism, specific consciousness, and ethics. So why is this overlap between the RSD and the USP graduate outcomes important? Well, we need authentic assessment of the graduate outcomes to show that our students are in fact developing those graduate outcomes at the end of the program. For example, the evidence of authentic assessment of graduate outcomes is critical for quality assurance, both internally and externally. Recently, the University of the South Pacific has gained initial accreditation by WASC. And in fact, the USP Seeking Accreditation Visit 1 institutional report that was prepared for that WASC accreditation has highlighted that embedding the RSD framework in courses contributes to the achievement and measurement of the USP graduate outcomes. So, we feel that there is a need for a deep level analysis to see whether the RSD-informed marking criteria that are used within the rubrics of specific assessments are assessing the individual criteria of the 7 USP graduate outcomes. So moving on, the research question then is, can RSD-informed marking rubrics assess the revised criteria of the USP graduate outcomes? I will now hand over to my colleague Shazna to present on the methods.
Okay, so what we did was we drew 12 RSD-informed rubrics from the research website. Now these rubrics have undergone some sort of a review process, and they're published under the Creative Commons licensing. And so we tried to include the 4 compulsory undergraduate courses, UU 100, 114, 200, and 204, because these are part of all programs. But additionally, we use purposeful or purposive sampling. And we try to ensure, and there's 2 things that really guided our selection of more rubrics. So firstly, we needed the assessment question. Okay, and we'll go into why that was so important. So availability of the assessment question, which we either procured out of the research office and their records, or contacting our course coordinators. And so, in terms of when the replies were received, etc. So that kind of guided whether a rubric was chosen or not. Secondly, we tried to include as many disciplines as possible, again, across the entire faculty. So we ended up selecting 4 first-year courses, including the 2 100-level UU courses, 5 second-year courses, including the 2, again, 200-level courses, UU, and 3 third-year courses. Now, the reason why we're not able to select more 300-level courses, just to have sort of a consistency across the 3 levels, is it appears that RSD has, basically, there are very few 300-level courses that have applied RSD, or rubrics are available on the research website. And also, there were instances where we had access to the rubric, but not really the assignment question. So in terms of a procedure now, content analysis has been quite widely used as a quantitative research approach, but there's increasing research using a qualitative approach, so qualitative content analysis. Now we use a deductive quantitative analysis approach, whereby we use the criteria for the 7 USP geos, and we use that as the coding categories to map, to create the categorization metrics, and then we try to use the RSD-Informed rubrics and map it for the appropriate level, so benchmark, milestone, and capstone within the geo rubric. We focus on really the explicit description of the geo within the rubric, so anything that was kind of vague we let go of. And then again, the assessment question was quite useful in terms of providing the contextual information on the assessment. So at times, in some of our rubrics, like creativity, focuses on autonomy in terms of learning. And so the assessment question gave us an indication of how autonomous or how much support was provided to the students in terms of working in the assignment. Now, Heena would actually show you exactly how that mapping exercise was undertaken. And I think we need to pull out another document for that. So a demonstration of how we did the mapping.
Thank you. So with the mapping exercise, this is just an example of how we mapped one of the courses to 1 graduate outcomes. We actually mapped all the 12 courses to the 7 graduate outcomes, but this is just an illustration of one example. So the graduate outcome on critical thinking and quantitative reasoning, which reads that graduates will be able to evaluate multiple perspectives and arrive at a reasonable independent judgment based on evidence. So this is a 300-level course, PD 301, Pacific Population and Urbanization Issues. And the RSD assignment that we used is a research report. Now we found that all the criteria that are covered in this research report are in fact at the capstone level of the university graduate outcome rubric on critical thinking and quantitative reasoning. So in other words, the graduate outcome critical thinking and quantitative reasoning is covered at the capstone level. It has got 4 criteria, and all 4 criteria are covered within the research report. So, so if you can just open up the Word document, I'll just show how we have mapped the criteria. So if we go down this Word document, these were the topics that are given for students to select. So students select one topic and they write a research report. Just go to the next page, please. And they write a research report on the topic. And then on page 3 is the RSD-based marking rubric. Yeah, go further down. So, yeah, so that's the RSD-based marking rubric, right? And so we mapped the 4 criteria of the geos to the criteria within this rubric. So, for example, for criteria 1, which is information literacy, we found that that is covered by facet evaluate and reflect. All sources are critically assessed, gaps in the data and literature are clearly identified, as well as by facet 6 on communicate and apply, because that's where the policy implications are discussed and the gaps and the gaps are being built on. So, and then criteria 2, which is on management of multiple perspectives, we found that that is covered under analyze and synthesize. Criteria 3, which is judgment based on evidence, that's again covered under communicate and apply, because they're looking at policy implications and how that is contributing to the topic that is being researched on. And then criteria 4 on quantitative reasoning, we found that this rubric is covering quantitative reasoning quite well because they're analyzing the data, interpreting the data, and presenting on that. So analyze and synthesize is also covering quantitative reasoning. So, and in fact, we found that there is quite a bit of overlap between the criteria. So there are more than one facet addressing one criteria. So if we can move on, so to the results slide. So moving on to the results section, okay, the one before this. Yeah, it's the one before this, right? So moving on to the results section. So this graph in fact shows the percentage of marking rubrics, that's a percentage of the 12 marking rubrics that are covering the different graduate outcomes. We found that communication, creativity, critical thinking and quantitative reasoning were covered by all the RSD-based marking rubrics. Ethics was covered by 75%, Pacific consciousness by 42%, professionalism by 92%, and teamwork by 25% of the rubrics. Yeah. So then, the second part of the results is we looked at which of the criteria within the graduate outcome rubrics were not covered by the RSD framed marking rubrics. So with communication, we found that three of the 4 criteria were not covered. So 8.3% did not cover criteria 1 and 2, and then 16.7% did not cover criteria 3. With creativity, we had a similar situation. Critical thinking and quantitative reasoning, criteria 1 and 2 were not covered by 8.3% and 16.7% respectively. Quantitative reasoning was not covered by 5 out of the 12 rubrics, that's almost 50%. Then moving on to the next slide. Ethics, again, ethics was not covered by 25%. Pacific consciousness was not covered by most of the RSD framed rubrics. Professionalism, not covered by 8.3%, and teamwork, not covered by most of the RSD framed rubrics. Now, Shazna will present on the discussion part.
So in terms of answering our research question, our study did show that we can use RSD marking rubrics to assess USP GEOs. So, and this is consistent with the broad level mapping that was undertaken by the research office. We also found that, and as you said, that communication, critical thinking and quantitative reasoning, ethics and professionalism, they were covered pretty well across all 12 rubrics that we selected for this exercise, so within the sample. But however, GEOs or graduate outcomes like teamwork and Pacific consciousness were very poorly covered within our sample. Now, this may be because that we did not go ahead and select rubrics based on what GEOs they were assessing. So we kept it pretty open, and that was one of basically our strategy, that we ensured that we're not contaminating our results in any shape or form. So we're not led to look for a particular GEO within the rubric. So we kept it open like that. So maybe a program level of mapping would show, because the requirement really for us is to ensure that a GEO is covered incrementally across all the entire program, so 8 courses. So it may be that the ones that we selected did not really go ahead or want to assess teamwork and Pacific consciousness, and therefore program level mapping will identify any gaps if there are any. Okay, we also noticed that some GEOs were assessed by the RSD-Informed rubrics, but not all of the sub-criteria were covered well enough. And a really good one, or one that really stands out, would be the critical thinking and quantitative reasoning rubric. So while the GEO itself was covered by 100%, all 12 rubrics assessed for that, the quantitative reasoning, which is really a new addition to this GEO, was only covered by, or was not assessed by 41.7% of the rubrics. So those courses that expect to assess now quantitative reasoning, the critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, they may need to relook at their assessment and their rubrics to ensure that there's some sort of an alignment. Okay, and Pacific consciousness continues to be poorly covered, and especially the second and third sub-criteria, the relationship between one's culture and one's position in the world, integration of traditional and contemporary practices to sustain Pacific societies. They were left out by 75% of the rubrics. Okay, and so again, if the 12 courses that we selected, of those 12 courses, those that wish to assess for Pacific consciousness, they will need to relook at the rubric to ensure that these criteria are mapped in there. So in some cases, the assessment question was not detailed. So one of our limitations has been rather that in some cases the assessment question was not detailed enough. And so there might be, and I do this personally, I would have an assessment question, but a list of other resources that students have access to. So just because we did not have all that entire information, we may not have been able to really map it accurately alongside whether it was sitting at a benchmark, a milestone, or a capstone. And this is especially for those geos where autonomy of learning is a key indicator on whether it would sit at benchmark or milestone and capstone. And we also identified, because it was also informing our rubrics in one way or the other, so when we try to map the geos to the RSD rubrics, we also find that maybe our geos also need to be relooked at, the graduate outcome criteria also need to be relooked at. For instance, we found that creativity seemed to be a bit too high-pitched for an undergraduate program, and so I think one of the things in which we could further this research would be to look at the phrasing and the design of the geo rubrics as well, and to ensure that this aligns with what the courses set out to do and what the assessments set out to do. And that is our presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Shazna and Heena.